You are listening to an After Dinner Conversation Magazine podcast. After Dinner Conversation believes humanity is improved by ethics and morals grounded in philosophical truth, and that truth is discovered through intentional reflection and respectful debate. In order to facilitate this process, we have created a growing series of print books, a monthly short story magazine, and 2 different podcasts. This podcast, Philosophy Ethics Short Story Audiobooks, provides audiobook recordings of the stories that have appeared in our magazine, and our companion podcast, Philosophy Ethics Short Story Discussions, is where we discuss the ethics of the choices made in the stories as a way to model the kinds of discussions we hope you're having with these readings with friends, family, and students. We would love it if you went over to check it out. I'm Roberta, your narrator and story editor at After Dinner Conversation Publishing. Thank you for spending your time listening to our podcast and for reading the magazine. Thank you for supporting us through your magazine subscriptions and through patreon.com/afterdinnerconversation. And of course, if you enjoy this audiobook reading, please subscribe to our podcast, share it on social media, and suggest it to friends. Today's story is Grandma Ruth's UP Truck Stop, written by Viggy Hampton and published in our May 2021 magazine. Grandma Ruth's UP Truck Stop by Viggy Hampton. Rachel's last semester at the University of Michigan would have been easy if not for the news that reached her 6 weeks before her final exams. It wasn't a phone call. The phone lines were still down from the most recent blizzard to hit Paradise, she guessed. Instead, a rumpled-looking envelope appeared in her mailbox, the ink of her address slightly smeared. She didn't recognize the return address at first, but anybody mailing her a letter from Paradise must be someone she knew. Paradise was a small town. Overwhelming curiosity forced her to open the envelope before she could even reach the front porch. In her haste, the sharp edge of the paper sliced into her fingertips, staining the letter with droplets of blood. "Shit," she said, sticking her finger in her mouth and sucking. She managed to pull the letter from the envelope with her uninjured hand and flipped it open with a flick of her wrist. "Dear Rachel, I'm sorry to have to be the one to tell you this, but your Uncle Stewart has passed. I know it's been a while since you've been home, and this will probably be painful for you. Stu's service will be on Friday at 10 a.m. at Our Lady of Victory. I really hope we'll see you there. Please let me know if you need anything, hun. You know we're all here for you. Much love, Ruth." Finishing with the letter, Rachel became acutely aware of the rancid copper taste in her mouth left by the blood. She pulled her finger from her lips and wiped it on her jeans, leaving a small streak of scarlet. Uncle Stu is dead. The realization sent electrical jolts into her eyeballs, which began vibrating in her sockets as the tears rolled out. She hadn't seen Uncle Stu since her parents' funeral 4 years before. Her mother's brother had been an enormous source of comfort as she grappled with the most severe tragedy of her short life. Stu had acted as gatekeeper in the living room, accepting gifts of casseroles and condolences from neighbors as Rachel worked through her grief in her second-floor bedroom, twisting her sheets into knots and screaming into her pillow. He had forced her to eat even when nothing sounded good, insisting that she needed to keep her strength up, and some calories would make her feel just a tiny bit better. When words weren't enough, he sat with her on the couch in silence, offering solace with his presence without the complication of language. How had Rachel thanked him? She'd driven off into the new dawn of college in Ann Arbor, making empty promises to call and write and to keep him apprised of her life. At the time, she'd felt too grief-stricken to keep her connection to Paradise strong. Looking back, she realized with a shameful ache that just as he was hers, she was the only family Stu had left. She'd been too selfish to realize that Stu was hurting too, mourning the death of his only sister right alongside her. Now Stu was dead, and Rachel hadn't spoken to him in years. He had tried to call on a few occasions, birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, But as soon as Rachel saw the 906 area code, she muted her phone and let everything go to the voicemails she never listened to. That could be the other reason behind the letter Ruth had sent. Word had gotten around that Rachel Regal never answered her phone. I have been such an insensitive shit, she thought, dropping to sit on the splintery wood in her front porch steps. She cradled her head in her hands, and the small tears of blood still leaking from her sliced fingertip left red smudges on her cheeks, like the world's most lurid blush. The day of her parents' accident, Stu was supposed to be on the boat with them. Mary and Carl had invited him along to cruise around Lake Superior before heading over to Takamenen Falls for a hike and a picnic lunch. It was early May and unseasonably warm. Everybody was out and about hiking the state parks, playing on the beach, biking through town. Rachel had to study for her upcoming exams, the last ones she had to take before graduation, before setting off for the full scholarship awaiting her at U of M. Getting in had been a breeze. She had 3 major things going for her. She was from a poor rural county. She was in-state. She was a woman interested in mechanical engineering. On top of all that, of course, she was the smartest one in her grade, which wasn't too hard in a graduating class of 23 students. But her parents always told her that didn't matter. Smart was smart, and Rachel was one of the good ones. She would make something of herself. Rachel knew it too, which was the main reason she had decided to forego what promised to be an incredible day out on the water to study in her cramped bedroom. She needed to get through one more academic push. She needed to finish things the right way. For her, the right way meant acing her last classes and graduating valedictorian. In the years that followed, she wondered over and over and over again how things would have turned out if she had gone with her parents. Maybe they would have seen the rocks in the water. Or maybe they wouldn't have been in that area of Lake Superior at all. Maybe they'd still be alive. Stu hadn't been with them that day because he had come down with a case of late winter flu. Mary had offered to stay with him, but he had shooed her away, insisting that she spend such a beautiful day outside with her husband. Life was too short to say no to those experiences. The irony, of course, was not lost on Rachel. She had learned of the accident later that evening, right as she was starting to get worried that her parents would miss dinner. When the telephone rang, she expected to hear her mother's warm voice letting her know they were on their way. So go ahead, preheat the oven for the baked potatoes. Instead, she heard Officer McDaniel's growl, husky with a grief she didn't understand at first. "Rachel," he said, "I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you this, honey, but there's been an accident." Rachel didn't remember much after that. Her mind skipped like a broken movie reel. She could only recall snippets, the sound of her own grief-stricken wails, as the coffins were lowered into the ground, the snotty smell on her pillow as she sobbed, the sandy taste of the macaroni and cheese casserole Uncle Stu begged her to eat. Her complete memories came back online once she reached U of M's leafy campus, as though she had broken through an invisible geographical barrier of grief. Without any reminder of her parents, minus the initially frequent questions about her family from fellow students, she felt a psychic scab form over her grief, closing the wound that her parents' death had cut. Now, sitting on her porch step, everything came hurtling back with unexpected force. On top of all that stale misery, here was something fresh to add to the pile: the death of her last remaining family member, the only other person who shared her blood, the only other person who held vivid, visceral memories of Mary and Carl Regal. "Fuck," she whispered, snot and tears pooling into her palms, which were chafed raw by the Michigan cold. Recalling Ruth's phrase, "I really hope we'll see you there," Rachel felt ashamed that any person could think she couldn't come pay her respects for her own flesh and blood. Of course she would go. With a Herculean force of will, she stood up and walked inside to pack as the sun set over the Ann Arbor skyline. If she left before midnight, she could be in Paradise by 6 a.m. Thursday morning. The atmosphere seemed to grow heavier the closer Rachel got to Paradise. The air tasted different, too, like sweet cherries that had just started to turn, a burst of sweetness followed by a lingering, rancid sourness that puckered lips and upset stomachs. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning, and a few more hours of driving still lay ahead when Rachel realized with a start that she didn't know how Uncle Stu had died. Wasn't that something people normally included in letters like that? Something as simple as, "The cancer finally got him," or "There's no way he would have seen the other driver coming," or "The fall killed him instantly." What if he had been sick for a long time, but Rachel never knew because she couldn't be bothered to answer the phone? A sob bubbled in her throat, and she fought against it as hard as she could. If she let herself drift over that edge into the greedy undertow of grief below, she'd never be able to claw her way back out. Once uncorked, that bottle could not be restoppered. Rachel hoped Uncle Stu hadn't suffered, that whatever it was that had killed him had done so as swiftly and painlessly as possible. That's what she would want, if it had been her. What if Uncle Stu had ended his own life? Ruth's letter had been so ambiguous that all possibilities were still on the table. Had he been found hanging in his garage, swaying gently back and forth? Had he slit his wrists before sliding into a warm tub and drifting away forever? Had he stuffed heavy lakeshore rocks into his pockets and walked into the icy cold surf, letting the water fill him completely? Rachel wasn't sure if she would ever know, and if she would ever want to know. She'd only ever questioned if there was something she could have done to change things. The response, a dangerous, perpetual motion machine of self-torture that she remembered all too well from the weeks following her parents' death. She turned her thoughts instead to the woman who sent the letter. Although she signed it Ruth, everybody always called her Grandma Ruth, or just Grandma. As far as Rachel knew, Grandma Ruth didn't actually have any children, much less grandchildren. But the matronly, maternal vibe she gave off attracted people to her. She owned Grandma Ruth's UP truck stop, self-nicknamed the best meal you can get in the Upper Peninsula, open 24 hours. Rachel finally remembered the thick buttermilk pancakes she got every Sunday morning with her parents, and how Ruth would surreptitiously sprinkle in a few chocolate chips, along with the blueberries her parents insisted on for vitamins. Grandma Ruth was pleasantly plump, as Rachel remembered her, harmless, and Betty Crocker-like. Always a pie in the oven, always a hamburger on the grill, always a pot of coffee brewing for the weary traveler. Rachel wondered if there had been a discussion about who would tell her of Stu's death, if her former fellow townies had all agreed on Ruth, or if Ruth had taken on the task herself because it was clear no one else would do it. Was it an act of love or of obligation? Could it be both? A neon sign blinking in the night off to her right caught her attention, pulling her out of her swirl of thoughts. Pinconning cheese shined out in the night, beckoning her. She almost laughed out loud. Pickening cheese, eponymously named for the town she was now driving through, had been a delicacy in her house. Whenever her father or Uncle Stu had gone downstate for business or pleasure, they'd always be sure to bring her back an entire wheel of sharp pickening cheddar, which she sprinkled over scrambled eggs, melted into tortilla chips, sliced onto sandwiches, and stirred into macaroni. Her mouth watered at the memory, and she realized she had skipped dinner the night before. She wanted to pull over and buy a block for old time's sake, but it was barely 3:15 a.m., and the Pickening Cheese Company and Fudge Shop wouldn't be open, of course. She knew a place that would be, though. She had never been to Grandma Ruth's UP truck stop before 8 a.m. or after 6 p.m., but she knew people who had, who practically lived in the cracked red vinyl booths and watched life pass by atop the crusty bar stools that had long since ceased their ability to spin. Those people, mostly, maybe all, men, were fathers, brothers, businessmen of the town. Something clearly called them to Grandma Ruth's. When she was young, she had heard a rumor that Grandma Ruth was hypnotizing them with a special potion she stirred into their coffees, or for some, whiskeys. When she was older, she came to the more depressing conclusion that all the men congregated at Grandma Ruth's simply because there was literally no other place for miles around that was open at night and had a liquor license. She was making good time. She could tell by how quickly the road flew by between Pinkenning and the old family fun park near Alpena. She had heard another rumor from an Alpena girl at U of M that a completely unhinged dude had started living in the family fun park and was trying to bring it back to life. Privately, the girl said she thought something much more sinister was going on. You know, like House of Wax, where all the people who go visit this super creepy town in the middle of nowhere end up disappearing because some guy makes them into wax figures while they're still alive. Rachel had laughed at that, but the whole idea made her uneasy. There was something about northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula included, that always left her feeling a little off-kilter, as though the smallest dip in the road would send her careering into empty space. She wasn't sure if that was just a feeling that blossomed in the wake of her parents' death or something more intrinsic. If she managed to get to Grandma Ruth's by 5 a.m., she'd get to see the last few straggling men sitting at the bar top, hunched over cold coffees or warm whiskeys. That would probably be the best time. She'd have a chance to speak with Grandma Ruth privately before the breakfast rush, before the matron of the town was swept up in the unexpected frenzy of another day. Rachel had always found the juxtaposition of her own life and Grandma Ruth's startling. Whereas Rachel had many lazy days filled with long hours of nothing, especially during the summer, Grandma Ruth seemed to be always busy, always moving. Sure, the truck stop required her attention, but surely not all of it. Before too long, the intimidating and impressive Mackinac Bridge loomed in front of her. If she kept up the pace, she'd reach Paradise in under an hour. She hoped she'd find the knowledge she was looking for when she got there. Paradise was technically an unincorporated community in the Upper Peninsula, but Rachel had never felt the absence of political or administrative organization, and she didn't think the other residents of Paradise had either. The people of Paradise were happy to hunt and fish their food, drink beers around the winter bonfire, welcome the summer tourists, and then spend the rest of the year subsisting on the summer people's money. For most of the people of Paradise, there were two things to do: hunt and drink. Everything else was just a variation of those two. If they weren't drinking at home, they imbibed at Grandma Ruth's, which now rose up in front of Rachel, the neon sign, the largest of its kind for miles around. Rachel noted with amusement, as she pulled into the parking lot, that a small but noticeable new sign had been tacked up at the front of the building, now offering massages. Of course, somebody like Grandma Ruth would think of all possible ways to keep the life and leisure of Paradise situated squarely in her establishment. She parked the car and turned off the engine, but didn't get out. Seeing Grandma Ruth's had enlatched to the box of memories she had shoved under the mental bed. Eating pancakes with her parents on Saturday mornings while sitting at the counter. Drinking paper cups of hot cocoa after going sledding with Mom. Stopping for a burger and fries after a long day of hiking in Taquamenon Falls with Dad. Those burgers had always tasted the best. But she supposed any food you eat after exerting yourself that much tasted incredible. With a heavy sigh, she forced herself to push open the door and get out. There was no sense in stewing on memories that, while happy, always made her sad. During her first few weeks of college, she had found the campus mental health center in her new student packet of resources. She'd considered making an appointment, even going so far as to dial the number and press send, but she'd hung up before anybody on the other end could answer. Something about spilling her guts and reminiscing about her dead parents to a person who didn't know her and couldn't understand where she was coming from sounded sacrilegious. Now pulling herself out of the car in front of Grandma Ruth's before attending the funeral of her only remaining family member, Rachel wished she had talked to someone back then. It would have helped her cope now. when there was so much more evading left to do. She was halfway to the front door when Grandma Ruth pushed it open with a flourish, calling out, "Well, if it isn't Miss Rachel Riggle, I'm so glad to see you, hun. Come on in." Just like that, Rachel felt 12 years old again, pulled into a matronly embrace that reminded her of her own mother. She tried to fight the tears, but they came anyway, flowing down her face and dripping onto Grandma Ruth's considerable cleavage. It felt so wonderful to be hugged, to be comforted. Rachel had forgotten what it felt like. Come inside, Ruth said, half carrying, half dragging Rachel into the restaurant. "I've got some fresh chocolate chip pancakes with extra whipped cream waiting for you. And hot cocoa?" Ruth asked, one eyebrow raised. "More of a coffee drinker now," Rachel squeaked, a thin smile at the corner of her lips. "Ah, yes, of course. You're an adult now. You should have your coffee. Please sit." Rachel took her favorite bar stool right in the middle. Ruth placed a huge platter of pancakes in front of her, along with a steaming mug of black coffee and a small silver jug of pure Michigan maple syrup. The food looked and smelled amazing, and Rachel dove in. Half the pancakes disappeared into her stomach before she paused to take a breath and look around. There was, as she knew there would be, a few stragglers littering the place. 2 men were hunched over coffees in the farthest booth, talking in low voices. Rachel didn't recognize them, nor could she hear what they were saying, but she guessed they were truckers making a quick pit stop before heading on to someplace else, maybe the Salt or Mackinac City. There was also a ragged-looking man leaning over a bar stool close to the door, his head nearly touching the counter. Rachel guessed that steaming mug at his hand had recently contained not an inconsiderable amount of whiskey. "Does it taste as good as you remember?" Ruth asked, popping out from the kitchen. "It's delicious, Ruth," Rachel said, taking a sip of coffee. "Well, I couldn't have disappointed Miss Rachel. That wouldn't do. And I'll say it once now so that we don't have to stay on the topic. I'm so terribly sorry for Stewart's passing, Rachel. He was a good man, and I know he loved you very much." "Thank you," Rachel said in a small voice, guilt filling her throat like sour bile. Uncle Stu had loved her, and not once in nearly 4 years had she even called him back. "Now," Ruth said brightly, moving on to other business. "How's the university treating you, Rachel?" Rachel swallowed another bite of pancakes, determined to push the guilt right back down her esophagus. "Not too bad," she said. "I've got my last set of final exams coming up soon. Then I'll be officially a Michigan mechanical engineer." Ruth clucked approvingly. "Who would have thought? I mean, of course I did, and your parents sure did, but really, a kid from around here making it all the way to Ann Arbor. And an engineer, no less. You'll build cars and things like that?" Rachel chuckled. "I guess some of the other students are into automotive stuff, but I'm more interested in artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, that kind of thing." A fire lit behind Ruth's eyes. "Robotics, you say? Now, ain't that something? Have you seen iRobot? That came to the Visualite Theater maybe 2-3 years ago. Don't you think it'd be scary to work on robots? They might just turn around and take over." Ruth winked, a smirk on her face. "Nah," Rachel said, pouring more syrup on her last pancake. "I read the book version, and I think what Asimov describes is decades into the future. Robots are still small, and computer systems, although they're advancing fast, just aren't there yet. I don't think we have to worry." "Well, I don't know about that," Ruth said, a knowing look that Rachel couldn't understand pasted on her face. "I guess you never know," Rachel said, gulping down the last of her coffee. "Refill, hun?" Ruth asked, filling her cup before Rachel could respond. "Thanks," she said. After a few beats of silence, Ruth said, "So, your Uncle Stu's service isn't until tomorrow. What are you going to do all day?" "I'm not sure," Rachel said, blinking away crumbs of sleep from her eyes. "I really didn't think that far ahead." "Well then, may I make a suggestion?" "Sure. Go drive past your old house. There's a really nice young man in there I'd love you to meet. He's still kind of new in town, and who knows, you might hit it off." Rachel laughed. "Ruth, are you trying to set me up? Is that really appropriate?" Ruth sighed in mock exasperation. "Well, what else are you going to do? And don't try to tell me you already have a boyfriend. If you did, I'm sure that boy wouldn't let you go out of his sight for a second. He'd be here with you." Rachel frowned, considering the idea. How wrong was it to go on a date the day before her uncle's funeral? Maybe it wasn't wrong at all, but shouldn't she feel some shame about it? Ruth seemed to read her thoughts. "There ain't nothing wrong with you having a little bit of light in your life right now, hon. His name's Marcus. He's some type of marine biology, studying the lake. I don't understand much of what he says, but he's smart, and you're smart. Voila! A match." Rachel laughed again. "Well, can't argue with that logic, huh?" No, you can't," Ruth said, removing Rachel's empty plate and mug. "It'll be light soon, and I know Marcus is always up early to go to the lake shore and collect seashells or something like that. Now's as good a time as any to go introduce yourself." "Ruth, are you kicking me out?" "Of course not, hon. But you're going to be kicking yourself if you don't go meet this young man. I have a good feeling about you two." Rachel didn't protest. She just stood up, stretched her arms over her head, and obeyed. Ruth was right. After all, Rachel could use a little bit of light in her life. The sun was rising over the lake as Rachel steered her car along the winding shoreline to her childhood home. She expected to feel needle pricks of pain as she neared a place so redolent with family memories, but instead she felt numb, as though all her emotions were confined to a shallow pool, where the deeper things she really cared about could not float to the top. On her right, the tidy 2-story clapboard house that had been her home for 18 years appeared within a tangle of tall trees. After her parents had died and she'd left for college, Uncle Stu handled the sale of the home. He insisted that the money would help Rachel pay for any expenses that came up in Ann Arbor. He didn't want her to feel like she couldn't go out and enjoy herself. Ultimately, he didn't want life to be any harder for her than it already was. The house looked much the same as it always had, with the exception of the newly constructed shed in the side yard. Rachel imagined that Marcus kept the tools of his marine biology trade nestled in the small outbuilding. Maybe he even had his own lab there. The thought made Rachel smile, and she was surprised to find herself warming to a man she hadn't met yet. She pulled into the driveway, and before she could get out of her car, the front door opened, and a solidly built, handsome man with dark hair and thick black glasses stepped onto the front stoop. He smiled broadly and waved her over. When she reached him on legs made unsteady with nervous energy, he said, "Hello. You must be Rachel. I'm so pleased to meet you." His voice was soothing but monotonous, like white noise. "Yes, that's me. You must be Marcus." He nodded, a quick, curt dip of the chin. "Yes, I'm Marcus. Would you like to come inside?" His phrasing felt stilted to her, but hey, living in a place as tiny and isolated as Paradise could wreak havoc on a person's social mannerisms. "Sure, I'd love to," she said, following him over the threshold and into the only home she had ever known. Once inside, Marcus swiveled on one heel to face her. The overhead light caught the shiny plastic of his glasses frames, but not the glass. Rachel realized with unease that his eyewear had no lenses. "Would you like a beverage?" Marcus asked, his lips smiling, but his eyes behind their glassless frames empty. Rachel said, pulling her sweater tighter around her. Marcus kept the house far too cool. "Sure. What do you have?" Marcus was silent, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked more like he was glitching than contemplating the answer to her question. Finally, after a few more awkward seconds during which Rachel clutched her sweater even tighter, Marcus answered, "Water, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, beer." "Whoa, it's a bit early for beer. I'll just have some water, please." "Water," Marcus repeated, swiveling on his heel with an almost mechanical exactitude and heading toward the kitchen. Rachel followed, trying to push her unease away by examining every wall, every surface of the place she had once lived. Were there any traces of her parents left here? Uncle Stu had made sure everything in the house was put into storage so that Rachel could go through it all when she was ready. She desperately hoped he hadn't missed anything. For some reason, the thought of artifacts of her parents' lives coexisting with this odd man made her shiver. She stepped through the kitchen doorway and saw Marcus filling a coffee mug with tap water, his back to her. The water pinged into the ceramic mug, then filled it, then overflowed, making alarmingly loud pattering sounds on the metal sink. Marcus stood there, hovering over the overfilled mug for at least 10 seconds before he finally shut the water off. Maybe he has OCD, Rachel thought. She'd known a girl in college with the same affliction. Casey Gerber had all sorts of rituals and repetitive behaviors that she was no doubt embarrassed by, but powerless to overcome. Rachel had heard therapy could help with that kind of thing, but as someone who had refused help herself, she was in no position to counsel others on what they should do. In Marcus's case, OCD might explain the odd way he had of moving, the overflowing water mug, even the fake glasses. As Marcus swiveled once again to face her, the mug in his hand, she felt a new wave of sympathy crest over her. "So," she said, taking the slippery mug from his outstretched hand, "Ruth tells me you're a marine biologist." "Yes," Mark said automatically. When he didn't expand further, Rachel prodded. "So what are you studying out here, then?" She took a sip from her mug. The water was so cold it burned her tongue. Marcus paused again before answering. "Marine biology is the study of life forms that live in aquatic environments." This definition could have come straight from the dictionary. Right," Rachel said. "I know that. I meant, like, what specifically are you studying here in Paradise?" There was the glitchy silence again, almost as if Marcus was computing her question before spitting out the most appropriate answer he could find. "I am studying the mating behaviors of the deepwater sculpin." "That sounds interesting," Rachel said, at a loss for a more probing question. "Yes," Marcus replied. It seemed to Rachel that Marcus had a much easier and faster time responding to simple questions and short phrases. "Have you lived here long?" "No," Marcus said. When he didn't elaborate, she pressed. "How long?" 375 days, 6 hours, 47 minutes. "Wow. Okay," Rachel said. "I've never heard someone answer that question with such a specific number." Marcus paused again, measuring his reply. "Sorry." No, don't apologize. It's just, you're really keeping count." "That's my job," he said. Rachel really wasn't interested in continuing the conversation any longer. Sure, Marcus was cute, and she was sure Ruth had good intentions trying to set her up, but there was clearly something off about this guy. Rachel had never met anyone quite like him, and the way he stared at her with his mouth hanging open before he responded to most of her questions gave her the creeps. "Well, I think I'm going to get going," she said, setting the mug on the kitchen counter. "Thank you for your hospitality." "I will walk you to the door," Marcus said, trudging past her toward the foyer. "Okay," she mumbled, trailing behind him. She wedged herself between him and the door, trying to get out as swiftly as possible, when Marcus stopped her with 2 strong hands on her shoulders. "Wait," he said. "I need to give you this." Without any more preamble, he leaned in with a jerk, like a bad animatronic, and pressed his freezing lips to hers. The sensation was so unpleasant, like being spread-eagled in stirrups in the gynecologist's office, that Rachel let out a little breathy scream and pushed Marcus away with both open palms. He took 2 steps backward before catching himself. The expression on his face was unchanged, still that look of dull, open-mouthed computation. "What the hell?" Rachel wheezed, wiping her lips on the sleeve of her sweater. "I love you," he said, the monotone of his voice reminding Rachel of the Furby she had had as a kid. A chill spiraled down her spine, and she wanted nothing more than to be outside. "Fuck off, dude," she managed before ripping the door open and bounding down the steps to her car. She fumbled the keys a few times before unlocking the door and slipping into the driver's seat. Once she was comfortably locked in her car, she risked a glance at the front door. Marcus was standing motionless on the top step, his mouth still open. There is nothing normal about that guy, she thought, as she slammed the car into reverse and backed out of the driveway. What the hell was Ruth thinking? She wasn't sure, but she was going to find out. She steered the car back onto the main road and headed up for the truck stop. The digital clock on her dashboard had just flipped to 9:03 when Rachel pulled back into Grandma Ruth's UP truck stop. Ruth's battered blue truck was parked by the back door, the only other car in the lot. Rachel found that a bit odd, given how, from what she remembered, many of the men in Paradise who actually worked would typically pick up a coffee from Ruth's to go right around this time during their commutes. When Rachel opened the door to the restaurant, Ruth was perched behind the counter as though she had been waiting. She was smiling, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Ruth," Rachel began, but the older woman put up a hand to stop her. I know, Ruth said, shaking her head. "He's a bit odd, isn't he?" All the fight went out of Rachel, and she plopped onto the bar stool opposite Ruth. Odd is an understatement. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I just thought maybe a nice girl like you could bring him out of his shell, so to speak. Override his normal programming." Rachel chuckled. "Look at you, Ruth. Normal programming? Although I don't think his programming is particularly normal to begin with." Ruth squinted, a barely perceptible twitch of irritation that Rachel didn't understand. "Well, he's tried, I know, to integrate around here, make friends. Really, he told me he's been here for a year or so, but he just seems so off." Well, now it was Rachel's turn to interrupt as she remembered the main source of her anger. "Wait, Ruth, he tried to kiss me." Ruth grimaced. "Oh boy, I was afraid of that." "What do you mean?" "Like I said, he's tried to get to know people, but I can't quite figure out what's up with him. He's not great with social cues." "Exactly. I felt like I was talking to a glitching computer instead of a person." Ruth's eyes flashed, a mix of hungry excitement and trepidation. How did you feel about that?" Rachel was taken aback by the question. Didn't her scowl say it all? Well, it wasn't fun, I can tell you that. It was sort of eerie, actually." "Eerie? How?" "This is going to sound ridiculous, but it was like talking to a robot wearing a human suit." Rachel shivered, surprised at her own ability to put the creepy feeling hovering around her into such terrifying words. Ruth, to Rachel's surprise, laughed. Not just a normal chuckle or giggle, but a full-blown guffaw. "What? What is it?" Rachel asked, a faint smile growing on her lips despite herself. Ruth took a big inhale and wiped tears from her eyes. "This is just too perfect," she said under her breath. "Rachel, my dear, there's something I need to tell you. I think it's about time." "Okay," Rachel said, suspicious. "Actually, it would probably be better if I just showed you." Before Rachel could say another word, Ruth stood up and disappeared into the kitchen. She hollered back, "Rachel, come on." She didn't really want to see what Ruth might have going on behind the plastic curtain. If it was related in any way to the disturbing encounter this morning with Marcus, then it couldn't be good. "Seriously, Rachel, you need to see this if you're going to understand." Rachel sighed as she lifted herself from the bar stool. Her feet carried her behind the counter and into the kitchen, where she found Ruth standing at a door of an industrial-sized refrigerator, sporting a sign jocularly titled to the left, reading, "Massages." Oh, God, Rachel thought. Ruth's face was solemn. "What I'm about to show you might be frightening, maybe a bit disturbing, but you need to see it. A lot depends on you being able to handle this, okay?" Rachel's stomach clenched into a tight ball, and she barely managed to eke out, "Okay." She was scared, but she was also curious. After all, what could a sweet old lady like Grandma Ruth really be hiding in a refrigerator? The elderly door creaked open, thanks to no small effort on Ruth's part. A light blinked on in the cavernous refrigerator, and Rachel had to squint until her eyes adjusted. She wished they hadn't. A body lay prone on a shiny metal table. Its feet were clad in scuffed work boots, into which the cuffs of worn jeans were tucked. Rachel followed the legs of the pants up to the bare back. 2 flaps of skin like window shutters jutted out from the body's back. But the flesh wasn't rumpled or stretched. It was smooth and taut, almost as if it were coating something hard and metallic instead of a plush network of tissue and blood vessels. In spite of herself, Rachel took a step forward into the massage room, one hand to her open mouth. As she neared the body on the table, she could see what the flaps were normally meant to cover: gleaming circuits, thin, colorful wires, and a set of massive, corroded batteries. What the? Rachel took another step forward until she was staring straight down at the body. She recognized the makeup of the circuits from her lectures and engineering labs, and for a moment her growing horror gave way to curiosity. The wires didn't appear to be connected in the correct way to make the most efficient closed system. "I'm so sorry, Rachel," Ruth said, but her voice was flat, no trace of the sympathy she had come to expect from Grandma. "Why?" Rachel began. But then her gaze drifted up from the control panel to the head, which was lying at an angle, one cheek pressed into the metal and the other facing away. Rachel held her breath as she walked around the head of the table to get a better look. She crouched down and found herself staring directly into Uncle Stew's open eyes. No, Rachel breathed, falling back against the shelves of butter behind her. She dislodged a carton of eggs which went plummeting to the floor, where several broke, releasing their sticky contents all over Rachel's feet. Ruth took a step forward, letting the refrigerator door close. "Rachel, you have to understand," Ruth said, closing the distance between them. Fat tears plunged down Rachel's cheek. "Why is he here, Ruth? What? How did he die? What is this?" The weeping accelerated, and Rachel could barely hear Ruth's reply over the sound of her own hyperventilation. Rachel, Ruth said, a cold comfort in her voice. "Calm down, hon. Why do you have his body? How did he die, Ruth?" "Rachel," Ruth said, her tone sharp. "He is not dead." Rachel's breath hitched, sending her into a coughing fit. When she recovered, she felt dazed. "What?" "He's not dead," Ruth repeated. "Let me show you." Bile rose in the back of Rachel's throat, but she felt paralyzed, powerless to stop Ruth from whatever she was going to do. Ruth reached toward the open control panel into Uncle Stew's back, where she reconnected a few wires using a pair of pliers she pulled from under the table. Everything seemed choreographed, as though Ruth had orchestrated everything up until this point just to achieve this grand reveal. Rachel wondered absently if she was going to be sick right here on the fridge floor. When Ruth was finished, she pushed the panel shut and shoved a finger in Stew's ear. Rachel heard a grotesque click and Uncle Stew blinked. Before Rachel could scream, Stew's mouth unhinged into an open O of surprise. It slammed shut, then opened again, this time accompanied by a tinny voice that said, "Hello, hello, hello." It reminded Rachel of her old chatty Kathy doll, which had been her mother's. By the time Rachel was old enough to play with it, Kathy's battery-powered voice box had long since deteriorated. When Rachel pulled the cord to make her talk, everything she said sounded like a venomous growl that sent the little girl running to find her mother. "Do you see now, Rachel?" Ruth asked, her eyes gleaming in the bright light. Rachel swallowed, struggling to get enough saliva in her mouth to respond. She paused, trying to collect herself. "What did you do to him?" "I didn't do anything that didn't need to be done, hon," Ruth said, having to raise her voice over Stew's repeated, "Hello, hello, hello." "But he's glitching now, that's all. He was one of the first I turned, on account of the cancer and all, and his batteries are messed up. Haven't been able to get a replacement yet." Ruth shoved her finger back in Stew's ear, and his face froze in a silent, open scream. "This isn't real," Rachel said, feeling her stomach heave. "This can't be real." "Rachel, hon, you're an engineer. You can see what this is, can't you?" "Ruth, I don't know what this is. Wait. How?" Rachel trailed off, her expression distant. She hoped she would lose consciousness soon and awaken back in her narrow bed in Ann Arbor. "You're not stupid, Rachel. We both know this town ain't much, and there aren't any young people lining up to move to Paradise. What's worse, all the young ones that are here are always trying to leave. I realized that a while ago, and I also realized that I needed to fix it if I wanted to stay alive. No town means no business, which means no food, no Ruth." Ruth paused. When Rachel didn't respond, she continued, "I'm getting old, Rachel. Too old to be fixing all these people, day in and day out. It was Rachel's turn to interrupt. "All these people? There are more?" Ruth chuckled. "Hun, believe me when I tell you that you and me are the only ones without batteries for miles around." Rachel detected a hint of pride in Ruth's voice, something she usually heard when the older woman was serving up her famous pancakes or topping off a steamy mug with the best coffee north of Mackinac City. But how? Rachel's mind still wasn't working at full speed. But Ruth rushed to answer her question anyway. "You live up here long enough, you learn to be a jack of all trades. You know that, hun. I'm not saying they all turned out perfect. Take Marcus, for example. But I got better over time. Remember Lou and Frank and Remus? In here this morning when you came in? Some of my newest work. Best damn robots north of Mackinac City." The disorientation of the entire situation finally caught up with Rachel, and she hunched over, spewing half-digested breakfast all over the floor. "Oh, hon," Ruth said, sighing. "Thought you'd have a bit of a stronger stomach for this, but I know it's not for everyone." Rachel coughed and spit out more bile. "Don't worry about that. I'll clean it up later. Right now I need you to focus, hun. Wouldn't it be nice to have your Uncle Stu back, to have some family again?" Rachel blinked stinging tears out of her eyes. "What do you mean?" With the roiling of her stomach dying down, her thoughts became clearer. "Isn't it obvious? Stewart is in need of some repair. That's true, but nothing that can't be fixed. You can have him back." Rachel inhaled sharply. "Have my family back." The thought was almost too precious to hold for long. "I could start over," she thought. "I could be the niece he needed me to be." "He might be mechanical, but he's still in there somewhere," Ruth said softly, as if reading Rachel's thoughts. "You don't have to be alone forever, Rachel. Don't you want him back?" "Yes," Rachel said, wiping her runny nose on the inside of her shirt. "Yes." "I thought so." When Ruth didn't move to resurrect Stu, Rachel said softly, "Bring him back, please." Ruth shook her head sadly. "That's why I need you, Rachel." "Me?" Rachel asked, her eyebrows pinching together. "Rachel, at 22, you're light years beyond where I've been my whole life. You've learned more than I could ever hope to. You can fix them all. Think of how much better they could be, Rachel, how much more alive." "But they're not alive," Rachel said. "If they can die, then they're alive. Without you, they'll all die." "They're robots, Ruth. They can't die." "That's nonsense. Everyone can die." Rachel stopped, considering. Having Uncle Stu back sounded too good to be true. On the other hand, why wouldn't she at least try to bring him back? She was smart. She could figure it out, especially with Ruth to help her get started. Didn't she owe it to Uncle Stu after all these years ignoring his calls? Blackness crept into the edge of her vision, but Rachel took a deep breath and willed the rising tide of unconsciousness away, even though she'd wished for it just moments ago. If I can bring Uncle Stu back, maybe my parents. Start with me today, Rachel. I'll teach you everything I know. Ruth sighed and stretched her neck. This town needs you, hun. They need you. I can't do this forever. Rachel considered. She was about to graduate, and even with her stellar GPA, she hadn't found a job that really excited her. She didn't know what she wanted to do with her life, and often wondered what her parents would have thought, what they would have wanted. "Stay in Paradise," Ruth said, her voice a gentle purr. "Keep this town alive, Rachel." She could learn the trade. She could bring Uncle Stu back. She could fix Marcus to her own specifications and learn to love him. She could have purpose. She could be the wizardess of paradise, the queen of a robotic Eden. It was an offer she couldn't refuse. "Okay," she said. Ruth smiled and reached out her hand, and Rachel took the pliers. And now for the discussion questions. Number 1. Is a robot copy that perfectly reproduces the responses of the original human as socially useful as the original human? What, if anything, is missing? 2. If you were in the narrator's place, would you stay in paradise and take over the role of building and fixing robots? Would you take some other course of action? If so, what would you do? 3. Can a person have an emotional relationship with a non-living thing? Should they? 4. Is it wrong to want to continue to interact with those you love? Is there social value in losing those interactions over time? And 5. Do you believe Grandma Ruth that she created these robots to keep the town alive? And that was Grandma Ruth's UP Truck Stop, written by Viggy Hampton. Next week, we'll be reading Abrama's Endgame by David Schultz. If you enjoyed this story, head over to our companion podcast, After Dinner Conversation Discussions, and listen to our discussions of this and other short stories from our magazine. We will include a link in the description. And of course, you can always continue the discussion on our webpage in the comment section or on our Facebook page. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.